December 9th, 2001. A 911 call at 2:40 in the morning. Michael Peterson says his wife fell down the stairs. But it's not what he said, it's how he said it. And when prosecutors started digging into his past, they found another body, another staircase, another wife of a friend, dead the exact same way. Part 1 of a story where nothing is what it seems. At 2:40 in the morning on December 9th, 2001, Michael Peterson called 911 from his home in Durham, North Carolina. His wife Kathleen was at the bottom of a staircase. She wasn't moving, and there was blood everywhere. And the first words out of his mouth were, "My wife had an accident. She fell down the stairs." That sentence would become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the entire case, not because of how he sounded, which was hysterical, but because of what he said and when he said it. Here's the thing. If you just walked into your house and found your spouse covered in blood at the bottom of a staircase, what would you say? Most people would be frantic. They'd describe what they're seeing. They'd say something like, "There's so much blood. Please hurry. I don't know what happened." They wouldn't necessarily offer an explanation for how it happened. But Michael Peterson did. Before he even described the scene to the operator, he told her it was an accident. He told her Kathleen fell down 15 to 20 stairs. He was providing a narrative before anyone asked for one.
Durham 911, where's your emergency?
1810 Cedar Street, please.
What's wrong?
My wife had an accident. She's still breathing.
What kind of accident?
Fell down the stairs. She's still breathing. Please come.
Is she conscious?
What?
Is she conscious?
No, she's not conscious.
Okay,
Please.
how many stairs did you
What?
fall down?
Huh?
How many stairs?
Stairs.
How many stairs?
Oh.
Calm down, sir. Calm down.
No, 15, 20, I don't know. Please, get somebody here right away, please.
Okay, somebody is dispatching the ambulance while I ask you questions.
It's in Forest Hills, okay? Please.
Experts who analyze 911 calls for signs of deception flag this immediately. When someone is genuinely discovering a traumatic scene for the first time, they don't have all the answers yet. They're reacting to what they see. They're asking for help. They're not explaining cause and effect. Peterson also said Kathleen was still breathing. That word "still" suggests that he's monitoring her condition, like he's been watching and waiting for something to change. It's a small word, but it implies a timeline that doesn't match the story of a husband who recently walked in and found his wife injured. The prosecution would later argue that Peterson's 911 call sounded scripted, that he wasn't discovering his wife's body. He was narrating a scene he already knew about. When investigators arrived, they found Kathleen Peterson dead at the bottom of the main staircase. The scene was disturbing. There was an enormous amount of blood. It was on the walls, on the stairs, pooled on the floor. The medical examiner counted 7 deep lacerations on Kathleen's scalp. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma from blood loss caused by those injuries. On December 20th, 2001, her death was ruled a homicide. Michael Peterson was indicted for first-degree murder. But here's where the case gets complicated. Despite those 7 deep cuts on her head, Kathleen had no skull fracture, no broken bones, no brain injury, no subdural hematoma, nothing. Defense experts would later point out that in hundreds of documented cases where someone was beaten to death, there was always massive brain injury, skull fractures, or other broken bones. Always. A fatal beating doesn't just cause scalp lacerations, it destroys the structures underneath. So the defense had a theory. Kathleen fell down the wooden stairs. Her head hit the sharp edges of the steps multiple times. That's what caused the lacerations. And the reason there was so much blood is because scalp wounds bleed heavily. Add in the possibility that she coughed up blood or that it mixed with urine, and you've got a crime scene that looks worse than the actual injury. The prosecution had a different theory. Someone beat Kathleen Peterson to death, and that someone was her husband. Michael Peterson was a novelist and former Marine. He had written books based on his military experience, including The Immortal Dragon and A Time of War. He had run for mayor of Durham. He had worked as a newspaper columnist, and in that role, he had been openly critical of law enforcement and the district attorney, James Hardin Jr., the same district attorney who would later prosecute him. Michael and Kathleen had what looked like a happy blended family. Kathleen was a successful executive at Nortel. They both had kids from previous marriages. They also had guardianship of Margaret and Martha Ratliff, the daughters of Michael's deceased friend, Elizabeth Ratliff. That last detail is important because Elizabeth Ratliff's death would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. In 1985, Michael and his first wife, Patty, were living in Germany. Their friend and neighbor, Elizabeth Ratliff, was found dead at the bottom of her staircase. She had recently lost her husband. Michael had been the last person to see her alive. He had dinner with her that night and helped her put her 2 young daughters to bed. When Elizabeth was found the next morning by her nanny, German police and U.S. military authorities investigated. They concluded she died of natural causes, specifically a brain hemorrhage, possibly related to a blood disorder called von Willebrand's disease. The official finding was that she collapsed from the hemorrhage and then fell down the stairs. After her death, Michael and Patty took in Elizabeth's 2 daughters and raised them as their own. That should have been the end of it, but 17 years later, prosecutors in North Carolina saw an opportunity. The prosecution petitioned the court to exhume Elizabeth Ratliff's body from Texas and bring it to Durham for a second autopsy. This happened just 3 weeks before Michael Peterson's trial was set to begin. The defense fought hard against this, arguing that they were being forced to defend 2 separate deaths at the same time, which would severely prejudice their case. But the judge allowed it. The Durham medical examiner, the same one who had performed Kathleen's autopsy, conducted the reevaluation, and suddenly the findings changed. The second autopsy concluded that Elizabeth's death was from a homicidal assault, 7 cuts from multiple blunt force impacts. The new ruling said that her injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. The prosecution never formally accused Peterson of murdering Elizabeth Ratliff, but they didn't have to. They just needed to get her death into the trial. The legal mechanism they used is called Rule 404B. It governs when you can introduce evidence of other crimes in trial. The rule says you can't use prior bad acts to show that someone has a pattern of behavior and therefore probably did the thing they're accused of. That's explicitly prohibited. But there's an exception. You can introduce prior bad acts if they prove something specific, like motive or intent, or identity, or the absence of accident. The judge ruled that Elizabeth Ratliff's evidence was admissible to show the absence of accident. The prosecution argued that 2 women dying at the bottom of staircases, both connected to Michael Peterson, couldn't possibly be a coincidence. Therefore, Kathleen's death wasn't an accident. This ruling was devastating for the defense, because now the jury wasn't just deciding whether Kathleen's death was a murder or an accident. They were being asked to believe that Michael Peterson had killed 2 women in nearly identical ways, 17 years apart. The emotional weight of that argument is massive. Even if the physical evidence in Kathleen's case was ambiguous, even if there were doubts about whether it was actually a murder, the presence of Elizabeth Ratliff's death created a narrative that was almost impossible to defend against. 2 staircases, 2 dead women, same guy. It didn't matter that the original German investigators found no evidence of foul play. It didn't matter that Michael had no motive to kill Elizabeth. The pattern itself became the evidence. The prosecution also argued that Michael Peterson had a motive to kill Kathleen, and that motive was rooted in his sexuality. Investigators discovered that Michael Peterson was bisexual. Between August and September 2001, he'd exchanged emails with a male escort and made plans to meet, although the meeting never happened. The prosecution immediately sought to introduce this as evidence, arguing that it was crucial to proving motive. The judge allowed it, ruling that it goes to motive. The prosecution's theory was that Michael's sexuality and his attempts to pay for sex proved the marriage was unstable. They argued that if Kathleen had discovered this secret, it could have led to a violent confrontation. They also pointed to financial difficulties and a $1.5 million life insurance policy. The defense pushed back hard. Peterson's attorney argued that Kathleen knew about and accepted Michael's bisexuality, that they were soulmates, that their relationship wasn't compromised by his sexual orientation. Even the male escort testified that Peterson had spoken warmly about his wife, describing a relationship that nothing could destroy. The escort also noted that many of his clients were married men whose wives knew nothing about their sexuality. But the damage was done. The prosecution spent significant time in closing arguments, asking the jury if they believed Kathleen knew her husband was bisexual. The implication was clear. A bisexual man who contacted an escort couldn't have a happy marriage. And if he couldn't have a happy marriage, he had a motive to kill. This was biphobia dressed up as legal argument. And it worked. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on one witness, Dwayne Deaver, an agent with the State Bureau of Investigation. Deaver was a blood spatter analyst, and his testimony was the only evidence that directly tied Peterson to the act of killing Kathleen. Deaver testified that the blood patterns on the stairwell showed several points of origin above the floor. He said this couldn't be explained by an accidental fall. More importantly, he testified that the blood on Peterson's clothing showed spatter penetration that was inconsistent with Peterson's story. Peterson said that he had cradled Kathleen's body after finding her. Deaver said the blood patterns proved Peterson was present when the blows were inflicted. But here's something interesting. Deaver had declared Kathleen's death a homicide within 90 minutes of arriving at the Peterson home, before he did any formal analysis, before he conducted any experiments. He walked in, looked around, and decided that this was a murder. The defense brought their own experts, including Dr. Henry Lee. They argued that the injuries were consistent with an accidental fall, that the large amount of blood came from profuse bleeding from deep scalp wounds, probably mixed with coughed-up blood or urine. They emphasized that a fatal beating that leaves no skull fracture and no brain injury is medically unusual. There was even a theory that got some attention later, though it sounds absurd at first, the owl theory. This theory suggested that Kathleen was attacked outside by a barred owl, a species known to attack humans. The owl's talons could have caused the scalp lacerations. Kathleen could have rushed inside, disoriented from blood loss, and collapsed down the stairs. There were a few details that supported this. 2 of the scalp wounds were shaped like owl talons. There were tiny wounds consistent with a beak. There were drops of blood outside the front door. And there was a feather found on Kathleen's body. The theory sounds wild, but it highlights something important. The scalp injuries were unusual. If they could have been caused by something other than Michael Peterson beating his wife, then the entire prosecution theory falls apart. In October 2003, the jury found Michael Peterson guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction rested on Dwayne Deaver's blood spatter testimony, on the prejudicial introduction of Elizabeth Ratliff's death, on the insinuation that a bisexual man with a secret couldn't be trusted, and on the absence of any other explanation that the jury found believable. But the physical evidence was ambiguous. No murder weapon was ever found. The blowpoke that prosecutors theorized he used was later discovered by the defense in the garage, and the jury dismissed it. There was no eyewitness, no confession, no direct evidence linking Michael Peterson to a violent act. What the prosecution had was a story, and sometimes a compelling story is enough. Michael Peterson would spend the next 8 years in prison, but the story wasn't over because the foundation of his conviction was about to crumble. To be continued in Part 2.